So take 10 minutes, you can talk amongst yourselves, you can think to yourself, and we'll come back to this in a couple minutes. So it's only been a few minutes, but I'm curious how it's going. Anybody have anything? You want a little more time to think through it? Okay. Is it one? Yeah. All right, anyone willing to share what you came up with? Yes.
Yeah, was the two domains I want to explore is the experience in the clinic, the experience of the subjects in the clinic.
Yeah.
Because my question is why they are regular and
Why they're-
starting to drop off
Okay.
in the service.
Mhm.
So I want to explore their experience, their satisfaction with the services.
Okay.
And the other domain is if there's any practical issues that made them not come regularly,
Okay.
preventing them from coming regularly.
Okay, so your domains are experiences of care, and your second domain is barriers to care, basically, right? Any example questions?
Tell me about your experience. Did you feel served? Did you feel helped in the clinic? About yes,
Yes.
satisfaction on the
Yes. Yeah.
And the other one, I just think I would ask: is it too far for you? Is it too expensive to come?
Mhm.
And then I could ask specific things, but maybe when they start talking, they can tell me about other barriers.
Right, exactly. And so one thing I might recommend is, rather than saying, was it expensive or too far, you could say, what made it hard or easy for you to come in? Similar to like asking them, did you like your care? That's creating the expectation, they're gonna say yes. So if you say, as you indicated, how do you feel about your care, that opens it up for them to say more. So I think the broadest that we can keep it, I think the more they're gonna share.
So I would ask like the other domain, how can I ask in a broad way?
What made it hard for you to get to care? Rather than, is it expensive for you to get to care? Because then they say yes or no when it's the conversations comes to a...
Maybe leading.
I'm sorry?
Could be leading question.
It could be leading, yeah. I think especially when you're asking them if they liked you and your services or didn't like you and your services. Because anytime you're saying, did you like this? It's sort of like, you have the power in this situation because you're the provider. And no matter how engaged you are with them, how much you care about them, you're still going to have the power. So if you're asking them to essentially say that they like you or your care, they're going to feel obligated to do it, right? And that could create more of a barrier, not only to your interview, but also to your care, because then they might start feeling like they have to say only nice things. So we don't want that. We want to hear everything. Okay, thank you for doing that. My example was almost exactly the same. I have the intro piece where we have like the consent and the background of the study, and then I have what kind of things made it hard to get to care, rather than is transportation a problem for you. And then I'm really interested in stigma in my work, the extent to which stigma makes it hard for people to access. Is that what you had already?
Yeah.
Yeah. What was your question?
It's almost because of almost it was the same example. The regularity for the and we were asking about the barriers. Not what then prevents you from coming. Are you dissatisfied with the service? Is it the appointment, the delay in the appointment now, the side effects of the medication, fear of the stigma of the mental illness? Yeah. And on the other side, we were asking about the financial support. So is it expensive to buy the medicine itself? You buy it yourself or you receive it at the clinic for free? Or do you have any insurance that support this? Concerning the transportation that is related to the socio-demographic and socio-economic standards as well. So, is your residency far? Are you employed or not? You're working in case if you're not working, is there anybody that can support you and help you completing and so on?
So I think these are great areas to ask about. It's starting to feel a little bit like a survey. Is this happening? Is this happening? Is this happening? Like, do you have a problem with this? Do you have a problem with this? And it does feel sort of short and truncated. I know it's just an example. And it may be more helpful if you keep that list in mind or have a list of things you really want to explore, but let them start by telling you what the barriers are before you ask them if it's a barrier. So again, keeping it broad.
And don't ask specifically about things that I'm assuming that they are the barrier.
It's okay to do that, but again, try not to do it in a yes-no way. So what I might do is say, what made it hard for you to get to care, as you did? And then they might say, nothing really. And then you could say, you know what, a lot of people have been saying that it's really expensive to drive here. How was that for you, So again, not just the yes or no, it's just broadening it. It takes, you'll play, yes?
Because I had other plans after dropping out.
Yeah. Yeah, you're asking if you're going to ask if they had plans after they drop out of care. Like you mean accessing other services? Yeah, I think that would be really interesting. That might get, because then you would find if there's something they like better about somewhere else. If there was something that worked better for them. Yeah, I think that'd be a really good idea.
So we're kind of doing also for the mental health awareness and importance, maybe some social standards, they just don't see that it's important to keep going to the psychiatrist for the mental health facilities.
Yeah, very. That's super interesting. Yeah.
As the trustees, there is a certain thing that you can bring up the domains from the research project, or it's up to the researcher?
It's up to the researcher. I think you want to build that around not just what you want to know, but what you already know. So from previous literature, from your team, from the experience you already seen, it's really not defined, it's for you to define as the principal. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's a big difference between quantitative.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It is less structured for sure. Okay. Yes?
Is it possible to conduct the qualitative research prior to setting up a service?
Yes.
Trying to anticipate whether it will be sought after by the targeted
Yes. Yeah, that's
clients?
a great use of qualitative research. So that's called like formative evaluation or formative research, where you're understanding whether or not it's going to be acceptable, whether it's feasible, what you can do to tailor it. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But these interviewer will ask the question as it's written. I know not verbally, it's not sticky to the what's
Word for
written.
word. Yeah.
But and the guide, the interviewer guide, what you tell him about something related to how you use this question to the.
In the interview guide?
Yeah.
So the interview guide is really just a list of your questions that you're asking a participant. Yeah,
just
yeah.
a response.
You will have other things filling out your protocol, like your confidentiality rules, what you're going to do if someone discloses something
And
unsafe.
the fidelity.
The fidelity, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But this guide is basically what you want all of your interviewers to follow. Yeah, and you yourself as well. All right, let's jump ahead. Using the guide. It's only a guide. You want to try to get all the questions, but again, you don't need to be word for word. The more you can be following that guide, the better it will be for you to analyze your data. I have a study right now where we're interviewing hundreds of interviews, and the questions keep morphing, they keep changing, which makes it very hard for us to develop a code book because they're getting all different data all the time. Try to memorize the guide so you can skip around. But you can refer back to it when you get stuck and forget what you're supposed to be asking. And the guide is especially helpful in the beginning of your analysis because you're going to analyze your data based on what your questions were, what your research questions were. So let's talk now about qualitative data analysis, which can take some time. So the basic steps, we'll go through these, but the basic steps are first you're going to transcribe your audio recordings. You're going to type them up or have someone type them up. You're going to read all the transcripts and develop a code book. And that's a lot of time commitment. And it's not just you, it's others in your research team. You're all going to be reading them and coming up with like your themes together. Then you're going to apply all those themes. We'll go through each of these steps, but you're going to apply all those themes, those codes, using the code book to all of the transcripts. And then you're going to group those codes. You're going to summarize them and come up with a story about your research. You want to keep track of what you did so that you can, remember it and be rigorous because it will probably take weeks or months to get through all the transcripts and you don't want to forget why you coded things a certain way. But you also want to be able to describe or defend your approach to other people that are reading your work. And so when you're publishing qualitative studies, the peer reviewers will often ask for more information or for information about how you coded, how many people coded, how you knew if the codes were being applied consistently, and so forth. So first step, transcribing recordings, use professional services. You can do it yourself. Again, it takes hours. One thing I recommend if you're ever transcribing yourself or having someone else you work with do it, you can get a foot pedal. Has anyone ever used these? It's just USB foot pedal. You plug it into your computer, and then there's some software you can use to play your transcripts, so you can listen to it in a headset, and then you can start and stop the tape with your foot. And it sounds like it's nothing, but it saves you an incredible amount of time to have to not, lift your hands off the keyboard, stop the tape, put your hands back on. So get a foot pedal. They're like, $35 US. I'm not quick on the conversion, but you probably are. You want to check between 10 and 20% of the transcripts against the audio tapes to make sure your transcriptionist has been doing them correctly. You don't want to lose any important data because someone hasn't typed them up accurately. Think about translation. If you're translating in a different language, just be mindful about whether you're interviewing and also translating and typing up in the same language or not. Just be sure that your person who's translating and transcribing has good knowledge of both languages, because subtlety here is really important, like the nuanced use of words. So after you have all your transcriptions ready, you're going to read them all. You're going to read every transcript that you can, ideally all of them. Familiar yourself with the data. I have a long drive to work, so sometimes I will just listen to the audio tapes. Even though I can't really make notes while I'm driving, I can just get familiar, things can pop up for me. It just helps me sort of...
Like in my interviews, but not others?
All of them. So if you and 3 of your colleagues were each interviewing 10 people, listen to all 30 of them. And that's really a great point. I'm glad you made that, because you may be getting different feedback from what other interviews you're getting. So read all the transcripts or listen to all the tapes, but you really want a sense of all the data that's out there. At least I would say 2 of you need to be reading or listening to all of the interviews. Because if it's just one of you, we're humans. Something seems important to us. I remember I did this in a study. Someone was talking about an issue that it felt so integral to me. It felt so important. And I thought in that moment, oh, this is going to be the thing we write about in the paper. It wasn't important. It just felt important to me. I guess it was important to me, but not that, and maybe that participant, but not all the participants. So it really needs to be more than one person, and you should read them all.
The one who checks against the transcripts against the audio is another one?
That could be the same person. It could be someone different. If you have a small team, you're going to be doing a lot of all the same work, right? Your initial analysis starts with your first few transcripts. So you're going to use the research questions that guided the development of your code book, and you're going to sort of compare the themes you think you're hearing in the transcripts and hearing in the tapes to the things you wanted to explore in the data with your original research questions. So you've probably heard about grounded theory. This is the idea that we're developing theory from what we're seeing. I think everyone says they're doing grounded theory, but often we approach research with really a theoretical assumption, something we think is happening. I think people are dropping out of care because it's hard for them to get to the clinic. That's not really grounded theory. We have a hypothesis going in. Okay. And the thematic analysis is sort of like where we have a framework in mind that we're trying to explore.
I don't get this.
So
And the grounded theory.
grounded theory is the idea that I don't really know what's going on with this population, so I'm just going to I'm going to develop my theory based on the data. But a thematic analysis is sort of writing up your results based on your theory. It's sort of like coming at it from 2 different directions. Yeah.
So in the thematic analysis, I'm having a background theory in my mind.
It's a little bit more of a framework. So that doesn't mean you want to stick to your framework completely, but you are having a set of questions. I think direct, barriers to care have to do with practical considerations or stigma. Whereas, and I'm trying to think of a good use of grounded theory. It might be something to do more with like relationships, allowing more to evolve naturally. But this code book, it's really important to get it right, because that's how you're going to help sort your data, your qualitative data, into codes. So once you've read all the transcripts, you feel like you're hearing some things that keep coming up in the data. People are talking about stigma. People are talking about their relationship with their providers. You're like, wow, everyone talked about their relationship with providers. We better have a code about relationship with providers. You could have one main code like relationship with providers, and you could have some subcodes like maybe supportive, maybe problematic, maybe, you know, whatever you're hearing in the data. But it's not like one time. You're going to develop those codes, you're going to try to use them, and then you might have to refine them. You'll almost always have to refine them. You don't know what you're going to find in there. You might have some ideas, especially if you're doing a lot of the interviews, but you really won't know until you read them all, listen to them all, talk with your colleagues about what they've heard, go back and forth. It's not a single shot. It's not like quantitative data analysis where you can, you know, run your regression and you have a p-value and you're done, right? Or maybe you're done. This is ongoing. Based over time, it's evolved over time based on some discussions with others. And you want to sort of check and recheck your codes. I have an example, but you're not, I think it's going to be too small on the screen, so I have one I'll pass out later. So I have another activity, but I feel like we have about 30 minutes left. So maybe better that we skip this activity and just move on? Is that okay?
But
All right.
the code book is, you said, the most important?
It is very, very important. So here's what I'll do. The activity is this. You were going to think back to what we were doing so far. I have another activity which I think is more illustrative. You are going to create some codes. So rather than working in small groups, do you want to just shout out some codes that you might think you might have been looking for or expecting to see in your data based on the domains you were exploring previously? Anyone? Did you have something? Okay.
Something like it wasn't satisfied, non-satisfaction of...
Yeah. So then, yeah, you might find that people are saying, I just wasn't satisfied there, or I didn't like this about it. So if you read a bunch of the transcripts, a lot of people were saying, I didn't like this. I didn't like that I had to sit in a waiting room where everyone there knew that I had schizophrenia. Like that, you know, I didn't like this.
For a long time
Waiting
or,
time.
Wait time, absolutely, yeah. So if you read a bunch of interviews and wait time comes up again and again, that becomes a code. And then you're going to go back through all your transcripts, and every time wait time is there, you're going to tag that wait time. Okay? When you develop a code, also develop a definition. What do I mean by wait time? Wait time is pretty straightforward, but it might be something like something a little bit harder to find.
Quality of service.
Quality of services, yeah. So you want to have a definition that's clear enough that everyone who's using that code, every one of your researchers, is using the code the same way. And that too will take some time to refine. These codes will change and expand. The more interviews you do, the more you apply them, and that's okay. Just a couple other points about the code book. The point of it is to help you understand your data and answer your research question. They will change over time. It takes a lot of iterations and discussion to use them, to clarify them. Your third step in analysis is where you code the transcripts with the codes you just developed. So the wait time, satisfaction with care. At least 2 people, depending on how many transcripts you have, at least 2 people should independently code each transcript. So you and I will take a transcript, we'll each take the same code book, we're going to go through that transcript, apply all the codes we see, and then we're going to sit down and talk about it and say, how did you apply that code? Oh, that's what you meant by wait time? This is how I was seeing it. All right, we have to define this definition. Or you might have found more experiences of satisfaction with care than I did. And I'll be like, oh, now I get it. I wasn't really thinking about this as being an element of satisfaction to care. So that process is called adjudication. We really go back and forth trying to make sure we're understanding what we're seeing the same way.
So,
I feel like the more I talk about this, the less clear it becomes. Sorry.
so first we put a name to the code
Yes.
and a definition. Then maybe we reinvent the definition after coding the transcripts.
Yes.
And double coding rather the same way like we do double data entry,
Yes.
for example, to double
Yeah.
check on
So
the
yeah. So once you've both coded that transcript, you're gonna compare your use of codes, adjust them as needed, and then do it again. But you have to do it a couple times to make sure you're coding consistently. And I would say maybe 20% of your transcripts should be coded by at least 2 people and checked against each other. So if you do 100 transcripts, 20 of them should be co-coded and compared. And you don't just do it at the beginning, you do it after maybe you've each coded 5, you're going to check back again to make sure you're still coding the same way. Have a third person in mind who can serve as an arbiter. So if you can't get to agreement about your use of code, make sure your principal investigator or you as a principal investigator can be ready to help sort of define that code more clearly. The last step then is you summarize the codes and you identify themes. You're going to read through all the transcripts that you've coded and summarize them. And you're going to start to then identify common patterns across the excerpts. So what I mean by that is you never want to make your qualitative data quantitative. So you don't want to resort to just saying something like, well, 20 of the interviews said this, so that must be the most important thing. And you will have peer reviewers who are going to try to get you to do that, but resist. Because what you want to get to is the most essential piece of it, not the most frequent piece of this. Because what can happen is you could have one participant who talks about transportation 25 times in their interview. If you're only going by a count, that's not getting to all of the participants, it's getting to one person who said it 25 times. So you want to look for codes that emerge across all the interviews, not just one interview lots of times. One thing that's really helpful to do is to, if you're using the qualitative software, there are several examples I'll give you later, you can actually print out all of the excerpts that have certain codes attached. So you can print out all of the chunks of text that talk about wait time. And then you're going to just read all the wait time codes together and then develop what you think a story about the wait time. You may be thinking, and you'll be correct if you are, that if you're just reading the excerpts with a code attached, it's really important that when you pull out that excerpt, you're highlighting the code to give you enough information that you understand the context of the question. So you would never want a code attached to just one word, like transportation, because then you don't know if this transportation is good, transportation is bad. You would attach the code to a phrase or a paragraph where a person's talking about transportation. And that way, when you pull out that excerpt, it can stand on its alone. You can understand it on its own. In addition to developing that story of the themes you're seeing, you also want to examine overlap or differences. You were talking earlier about different patient characteristics. You may find that patients with a certain ethnicity or religion or age have similar variables. So then it could be really interesting, or socioeconomic status. So then it could be interesting to explore each of your themes by different subpopulations in your participant group. And then you can also think about how codes come together. So you can look at codes or themes like, perhaps people are talking about stigma, and they also talk about stigma as it relates to having a certain mental health diagnosis like schizophrenia. So then stigma and schizophrenia become united in one larger code that becomes perhaps more interesting to your study. So you've got lots of levels of analysis here. You're seeing how your codes are applied to all the transcripts. You're seeing how all the codes emerge as a whole. And then you're also looking to see how your codes sort of crisscross against each other or across your participants to understand where they're more important. And then you write up your major themes. And when you're writing a qualitative paper, we typically like to use excerpts that explain our code. So, in the mental health study, you might have people talking about how hard it is to come into the waiting room. This happened actually in our HIV study. People talked about the fact that in a previous clinic, they didn't like being in the waiting room because everyone knew they were HIV positive. So we had a really nice quote about how uncomfortable it was for them. Rather than just saying this was an important code or a frequently emerging code, we had a quote from a participant to illustrate our idea. Several different kinds of qualitative data software you can use. In vivo for us is a little bit expensive. You may be able to get it through your university. There's also something called Deduce, which is web-based. It's a little bit less expensive. Deduce is nice because it is web-based, so different people can be using it in different places. So if you're collaborating with a researcher at another university, You could both log on and see the same transcripts. Atlas is another one. You don't need any of these software programs to qualitatively code your data, but it is nice because you can imagine if you're doing all of the coding on paper, you would be maybe highlighting and jotting some notes or adding some colored paper clips, maybe, sticky notes with your themes on it. That's fine. You can do a very rigorous study that way. The first paper I showed you was not using any qualitative software. We just used an Excel spreadsheet. We had all of our quotes, all of our transcripts in Excel in paragraphs, and then we had a column where we added a number for each of our codes, and then we could just sort by the number of that code and look at all the codes together. Perfectly fine. Qualitative data software will do that for you. So it will allow you to pull transcripts that either are frequently coded, it allows you to pull excerpts that are frequently coded with a certain code, or it allows you to pull two codes together and read all those transcripts together. It just helps you sort of manipulate your data a little better. It's not required though. There is a free web-based program called QDAP. You might want to check that out. One thing I want to mention is that I'll make my handouts available to you with these notes, so you'll be able to refer back to them if you want. All right, so we have 30 minutes left. So I want to spend maybe, I do have a transcript that I've made anonymous. You could practice coding if you want. Would that be a good use of maybe 10 minutes? I do also want to go back through the safety protocol issue. So should we do the activity? Yeah? Okay. All right. So this is part of a transcript. This is part of a transcript from the interview, from an interview we did from that first study I talked about, which was residents of our harm reduction housing program. I'm sorry? You could do it in a group, you could do it alone, whichever you want. We're only going to take about 5 minutes. The idea is just to give you a flavor of what we're doing. So what I'd like you to do here.
May I have a question?
Yes.
Please, what about sampling? If you have this problem, you identify the problem, they are not attending regularly the service. How you sample? You make a representative sample, or how can you do this?
Yeah, so are you asking about recruiting people who have dropped out of care, or are you talking about making sure your sample is representative?
No, I am asking about how this is the problem. This is the main problem question.
The main problem question is?
The question is that these persons are not attending regularly the service.
And how would you make sure you have the right sample to understand that question? Is that what you're saying?
Ask, how many persons?
How many?
How many persons you will interview?
Right. So
and
you.
This is, how you choose the persons you interview? They have the same problem.
So the unfortunate thing about qualitative research is there's no power analysis that will tell you how many people you need to sample to get, based on your effect size. You don't have that here. That's the hard thing about qualitative research is you're making these decisions based on what you know about the problem, what you know about the patients, about what you want to know. It's really up to you. We typically say that most qualitative researchers believe that you need to recruit at least 20 people to feel assured that you're having depth, that you're understanding, that you're seeing what you think you're seeing, that you have saturation. Sometimes you will do 15 interviews and you'll feel you've achieved saturation. There are no new themes really emerging. Sometimes you'll do 20 interviews and you'll say, wow, I really don't feel like there's any consistency here. I still don't have any idea why people are not coming to care. I need to do a bunch more interviews. So there's no magic number. It's all based on the clarity emerging, on the themes emerging. I don't know how else to answer that.
So how you generalize the results?
You don't generalize the results. Qualitative data is not meant to be generalizable.
Yes.
It's meant to be transferable. It's meant to be
Descriptive?
Descriptive, yes.
Descriptive,
Yes.
yes.
But when people say their qualitative data is generalizable, there really is no way to generalize this because we can never have that statistical significance with qualitative data. So here's our research question. What helped people improve their adherence? What challenges they experience? What was the most meaningful part of the program to them? This is what we wanted to know. So just take a minute, read through the transcripts, and see if there are any pieces of information that you think help answer these questions. What are people talking about in this transcript that relate to these questions? Is it okay if we talk about this now? I know it wasn't much time. Did you start to see any patterns, or any, not patterns yet because you've only had one transcript, but did you start to see any sort of clues here, any things that this person was talking about that you think respond to these questions? Yes? The new baby, right. Absolutely. So that is one thing that we didn't expect to see when we developed our initial code book. We were asking about things like stigma and direct support. But the new baby was interesting because that made us think, oh, this is something that's like motivating to that resident. So we might then develop a code about, motivating or reasons for change. Yeah, good pickup. Anyone else?
Care of stuff.
I'm sorry?
Stuff about caring of people, stuff. Something that was often brought like work, what's
The staff?
the staff? He praised the staff people.
He likes the staff people, yeah. He feels
Yeah.
cared for by the staff
Yeah.
people. Yeah. I'm sorry, you were going to say something else.
He said he was a wreck before he went to this housing program, so he was saying stuff like jail stuff and addiction, so I guess that
Yeah.
was an improvement in a few years, and I don't know the significance of this, but I think this is what helped him, that he's seen a change, a huge change in his life.
Right, that's absolutely right. And that's actually one of the key themes that ended up sort of rising to the top in this study, is that people started talking a lot about how their substance use changed. Which is interesting because our housing program does not require people to not use them. It doesn't ask them to stop using substances or change using substances. But they were all talking about how they would change their substance use after stabilizing. So that, exactly right, that became one of our key themes because a lot of people started talking about that. And so the other thing that people talked about was financial management. There's that one part where he said something about they helped me pay my bills. And so many of the interviews we did talked about this bill payment system. So we helped people pay their bills because they needed to keep paying rent so that we could pay the mortgage on the building and keep our doors open. But they said that bill payment helped me. That saved my life. We had such strong reactions to the bill payment, which no one really wanted in the beginning because it made them feel less independent. But because of this feedback, we're now doing this whole other study funded by our National Institute of Health in which we're testing just that financial payment system to see if that's part of what's helping people improve their HIV adherence. So that's just one example of how this qualitative research helped us come with this whole other research question and intervention, really. Can you see how this is starting to fit together? So I'm going to share with you the code book that we use, just because I think it's good to have an example of a code book. Do you mind? All right, so I'm sorry we don't have more time to play here with this, but I am going to move on just because time is short. And so really the last thing I want to talk about is this research with vulnerable populations. Often people who are marginalized, who are fragile, are exactly the people we want to interview. We want to understand their experience because they can be the people who are least likely to be served. But again, when we're interviewing vulnerable people, it can make them uncomfortable. It can put them at risk for experiencing, being re-traumatized. So some things to consider are that all of the qualitative research training I've gotten, no one has ever talked about how to protect our participants. And so, if fragile populations are a key interest to us, then it's really important that we consider our special considerations for them. It's really important that we're prepared. So I have a case study here I want to share with you. It's going to be small on the screen, but basically it's one of my colleagues did a school climate survey. So he was doing video interviews with LGBTQ youth, sexual and gender minority youth, to understand the extent to which they're being bullied in school. So he was doing these video interviews, and one of the participants shared suicidal ideation during the interview. So I think I'll just skip this slide. This just describes. So there was no protocol in place for what to do if someone expressed suicidality, because we were not asking questions about suicidality. We were asking questions about bullying. And it was particularly challenging because this individual was a minor, a young person who was in another state. So it's not like when you have someone in front of you. I once did an interview with someone who was expressing suicidality. So I stopped the tape, did a suicide assessment, and got him linked to care. You stop the tape, right? You're not going to keep interviewing at that point. But that person was in front of me. This individual in this study was states away. There was no way for us to get to them. So fortunately, this individual's suicidality, our interviewer did an assessment, found out who knew about his mental health condition, asked to speak with his parents, assured that he was connected to care. It worked out in this case. But now we have a protocol in place to make sure that we have a plan for if this happens again. So we have a plan for if we're picking up on something, we want to make sure we know how to do a suicide risk assessment. I'm sure you're all much better at that than I am, but it is important for us all to have that plan in place. And we know, of course, that asking people about their whether or not they're considering suicide doesn't elevate the risk of suicide. I think many qualitative interviews aren't going to have the psychiatric experience that you have, so you would probably be better suited to be doing interviews in these situations than I would be. In your participant safety plan, I would make sure that you include how to collect and capture information so you can both protect confidentiality or anonymity, but also that you have the clear expectation of when you will break confidentiality and how you will do that, as we were talking about earlier. You need to make sure you have a plan in place to assess risks among your participants, how you're going to assess suicidality or any other risk you think they're having. I had another study where we were testing an intervention we developed to reduce HIV risk among African American women, in which we were also helping them develop condom negotiation skills with their male partners. And we realized that if we're asking women to start asking their male partners to use condoms, we were afraid that we might be putting them at risk for intimate partner violence. So we made sure we had a plan in place to assess whether or not they were experiencing violence in their relationship as a result of having these talks about condoms, and then what we would do with it if they expressed that they were. So we need to know how to collect data so that we can follow up with individuals if we need to, especially if we're not face-to-face with them. We need to know how to assess risk. We need to know what we're going to do if that person does indicate they're in danger or putting someone else in danger. And I'm guessing in the context of your work, you probably have those protocol already developed for you, which is great. Finally, make sure you have a plan for documenting your event. There needs to be clarity about who's reporting what to whom. The principal investigator needs to know. Your ethics review board will probably need to know if the questions you're doing with them is putting someone at risk, or if it's considered to be elevating their risk, then your IRB will want to know that. We also have a data and safety monitoring board for our larger study. If we're finding that many participants are reporting suicidality, then we might need to change our approach or consider the fact that we're actually elevating their risk as the result of asking them to relive these experiences. And I will share the handout we developed, or the protocol we developed with you later as well. So just a few final thoughts. Going back to this idea of increasing rigor, some other researchers did a systematic review and came up with a checklist for interviews and focus groups. I don't think you have the clarity to see what this is, but basically you're encouraged to consider information relating to like you as the researcher, how that might influence your findings. For example, I'm one of the founders of our housing program, so I probably have good ideas about what I want to see in the data. I'm probably the worst person to be doing interviews or analyzing the data because I'm biased already. I want to see a certain outcome. You also want to think about your study design. This is just a checklist that will help you design your study in a way to demonstrate that you have rigor. And then there are also standards for reporting your qualitative findings. And I find I use this checklist all the time when I'm writing up a paper for a publication because this directs us to report on simple things like the title, include an abstract, but also to report on your methods, to report on your analytic approach, to describe how many research you used, how many, what % of your interviews or transcripts were co-coded, and so forth. So I'll also share this paper with you as well. The last activity was to have you think about how you would apply qualitative methods in your own research. You can think about that in your own time. Feel free to email me if you want to chat. It's just still the activity. I do want to save some time for questions, but I also want to thank my colleagues, Dr. James Egan, Dr. Robert Coulter, Dr. Abisola Onayu, all of whom contributed to this presentation and whose work I've used as examples here as well. And two things I want to point out here. My email address at the top, but that link at the bottom will direct you to all of the handouts that I've shared here, as well as some others. So those checklists I showed at the end, they're freely available, but I have PDFs for you in that link. Later tonight, I'm gonna upload a PDF of my slides to that link as well, so you can, it's just a Google folder that you can access. So, how are you doing? What do you think? Do you buy it? Do you not buy it? Do you have lots of questions?
No, thank you so much. It's very interesting and a good start for us to know more about qualitative research, because we are starting from the scratch actually.
Okay, all right.
So that we appreciate that let us get in it very easily to know the main frame of the qualitative research. I have just one or two questions. Because I am from the quantitative research group.
Right. Yeah.
But here we ask about like the sample size, what is the problem in bias, if there is anything we have to take